Reading from the book that I wrote called The Bible as Truth, Musings about Evolution, Jesus, Hell, and Salvation. I'm reading from Chapter 1, Modern Science and the Bible. My dad had his own small library, mostly stocked with science and science fiction books. The Life Nature Library was a constant in my childhood and teens. Much of the research for primary school science class essays came from our own home library, and I grew up to love both science and science fiction. I've always loved learning about how things work, and science was my favorite subject. For instance, I was the only grade 5 student in my science class who wrote essays about Gregor Johann Mendel's work as a pioneer of the science of genetics, or about Cepheid variable pulsating stars. More about Mendel later. We moved to the province of Quebec when I was in grade 6, and I usually found myself enrolled in Roman Catholic schools, where my best subjects were religion and science. The only nickname that ever stuck to me more than a few days was Professor. Okay, perhaps not physics so much, but I did well in chemistry and particularly well in biology. I was the only grade 9 student in grade 11 biology and came out with the second highest grade in my class. It was during biology class that I came to the conclusion that the theory of evolution was not scientific or even realistic. Remember Gregor Mendel? He actually did experiments to determine the frequency of trait transmission between generations. He came up with laws of genetic trait distribution based on his theory of dominant and recessive genes. He published his work in 1866, but it was ignored by the scientific community for almost 35 years. He was rediscovered in 1900, long after Charles Darwin became the darling of the world of science with his On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. Even in grade 9, the inconsistencies between Mendel's scientific research on genetic inheritance and Darwin's speculative hypothesis of mutation and natural selection made me realize that Mendel was on a far more scientific foundation than Darwin. Why anyone would try to graft Mendel's work onto Darwin's is still puzzling to me to this day. In my opinion, if Mendel had been published and widely distributed first, Darwin would have been laughed out of the scientific community for spouting nonsense. The more we learn about actual science of DNA and its supporting systems, the more untenable evolution from non living to living and from unicellular life to human life becomes, at least for anyone who wants to apply common sense and logic. For instance, did you know that the same strand of DNA can be read in 6 different ways for different purposes? Try writing a piece of computer code that can be read forward and backward and still make sense. Then try to read that same piece of code at irregular intervals, in small pieces, both forward and backward, to perform different functions. For DNA, that works really well, but not so much for human computer programming. Now, try plugging in a computer and without any initial setup, let it program itself randomly without any human intervention and see if you can get that kind of code. Here's what Dr. Robert Carter, with a PhD in marine biology, says about the flexibility of, quote, overlapping DNA and RNA codes. Multiple overlapping DNA and RNA codes defy naturalistic explanation and make it impossible for natural selection to operate as an agent of long-term evolutionary change. Selection runs into a, quote, wall of insurmountable difficulty, end quote, when faced with mutations that affect more than one trait simultaneously. How could a simple process of trial and error, always seeking the simplest answer to an environmental problem, create an interleaved and multi-layered system of regulation? Without this level of multitasking, the genome would have to be much larger and might not be possible for DNA-based multicellular organisms to exist at all without it. And that's a quote from Evolution's Achilles' Heels, pages 64 to 65. DNA can only do its work when the technology to support it is already in place. It must be created from surrounding materials, coded intelligently, and already have access to machinery to turn the instructions into proteins or to control other protein driven processes. I've had basic electronics repair training and computer programming training. I did not do either of those as a career, but I did find ways to apply the programming training at work in a media corporation. For example, I wrote a program to generate a report about how many times we aired a promotional ad for any cultural organization we were sponsoring. The colleague I wrote it for would enter its title or number, the start date and the end date. The program would find the appropriate logs for the dates, search them for the string of characters, find the associated time, and type the text in a Word document. When it finished all of the logs within the dates, it would stop. In order to set it up, I had to negotiate with the IT department to receive permissions to go to the part of the network with the logs. In order to receive permission, I had to promise to copy each log so that the original would not accidentally be destroyed or altered, and then delete my copies to retain corporate confidentiality. I had to add these processes to the program and show it to the IT specialists. Every cell has an equivalent system to control access and ensure its data is not corrupted. The computer I did the programming on, and the one my colleague used, were designed by engineers and designers in another country. It was likely built in a high tech factory in yet another country. The language I programmed in was developed by software engineers working for Microsoft. I had to learn that particular language from the help files in a pre existing macro language in Microsoft Word. The network I was on and needed permissions for was installed and operated by the company's information technology group. It consisted of servers and wiring that had to be installed and maintained by them. All of that ran on electricity provided by a provincial utility corporation from a combination of coal fired, hydro, and nuclear plants operated by engineers and technicians from all over the province. All of these parts had to exist before I could create my small and very basic program. The point of all of this is that DNA cannot even work unless all of the parts of the cell are already in place and functioning optimally. Enzymes and protein construction machinery need to understand the language of the DNA code in order to know what to make and how to make it. Enzymes and other proteins are required to read the code. Manufacturing machinery must be in place and working to produce the enzymes that can read the code. The machinery to duplicate the instructions, messenger RNA, must be in place to program the machinery that manufactures the proteins. Proteins and a transportation system must be in place to take the mRNA instructions to the manufacturing machinery, etc. The cell is incredibly complex. Darwin had no idea how complex this whole system within the cell is. And it only gets worse. Multicelled organisms produce chemicals that signal other cells to do things cooperatively with them, called hormones. Brain and nerve cells send electrical signals to other cells too, coordinating in humans for thinking or emotion or speech. How this happens is still a mystery under investigation by scientists. The language encoded in DNA allows all of this to happen. But how did our cells learn to read this language? This also is a mystery. As I write this, we are 2 years into a pandemic, into which a seemingly miraculous vaccine, actually a genetic therapy, was introduced. It took about 30 years of meticulous scientific research and careful planning by American and European scientists to patent the messenger RNA delivery system, and a team of Canadian researchers to develop the liquid nanoparticle envelope to protect the mRNA and allow entry into cells. Without the previous 30 years of thinking and researching, it would not have been possible to develop a vaccine in less than a year. Even with all the careful planning, we're discovering that this vaccine is resulting in unexpected effects, such as distribution of the mRNA to all major organs, when it was literally designed to remain at the injection site. The protein was cleverly designed to remain attached to the cell wall of the affected cell, and yet somehow managed to emerge into the bloodstream and circulate throughout the body. While some speculate that the spike protein is dangerous in its own right, my purpose here is not to speculate on safety or efficiency. of this intervention. My goal is to demonstrate that the intelligence required to design the body's genetic and associated systems clearly exceeds that of even the best human researchers in our time. Our genetic systems are so finely tuned that any human interventions seem to lead to unintended consequences. These are things that can and do happen when intelligence is carefully applied to complex genetic systems. And yet we somehow want to believe that random mutation can produce the complex and interconnected systems that are found in all earthly organisms. Something akin to blind faith in evolution is involved in this kind of thinking. The findings above suggest that whoever programmed DNA and set up the systems supporting it is a lot smarter and, quote, technologically, end quote, advanced than any human being. I say this kind of amazing feat of engineering production is worthy of a true God. Of course, let us not forget common sense. When was the last time you saw something coming from nothing that was not a magician's sleight of hand? When was the last time you saw a house or car prove itself without help from a human being? No, there are established laws that say that energy tends to work its way down to its least usable form. Entropy. Simply put, things decay or wind down. Rocks and land erode, stars burn out, and non living chemicals have never been shown to spontaneously form living organisms because they break down in conditions of oxygen, water, and solar radiation. Why is nonsense being taken seriously by people who claim to be using the scientific method? The answer? Many of them do not want to answer to a creator God or have been hoodwinked by an anti God propaganda campaign that tells a story about a creation without a creator. So, just a brief reading from the first chapter of the book, The Bible as Truth, Musings about Evolution, Jesus, Hell, and Salvation, available on Amazon and on the Advantage Booksellers webpage, published by Advantage Books. Of course, the hope is that you might be interested enough to actually buy the book. But hey, I hope at least this little piece of it was entertaining in its own right. Thanks.